going to begin by going over or reviewing ventilation and oxygenation. Here are the objectives for the lecture. Student will understand the definition of ventilation and oxygenation, know how the adequacy of ventilation and oxygenation is measured, define ventilatory and respiratory parameters, know how to calculate dynamic and static compliances, understand the difference between compliance and elastance, define and calculate airway resistance and mean airway pressure, define dead space and know the different types of dead space, master the clinical factors that affect airway resistance, define FiO2 and know safe and toxic levels of FiO2, know the differences between shunts and dead space diseases, define and understand the full life functions. And that is where we are going to start. Now, what is life function? Now, life function is being able to get oxygen molecules from the air all the way down to the tissues. That's what life function is, getting oxygen molecule from the air all the way down to the tissues, because the oxygen that we breathe in is actually being used at the tissue level. Okay, so this is what is going on here. So this is the lung here, the unit of the lungs, the alveolus. So you're breathing air that has oxygen in it. It comes down into the lungs like that. But you don't stop there. It's got to keep on moving because we're going to the tissues. So the next thing that happens then is that the oxygen has to diffuse into the blood, from the lungs into the blood. Comes in here, but we're not done yet because we're going to the tissues. The next thing that will happen then is that oxygenated blood has to be pumped out from the heart, from the left heart. It is pumped out, and then it circulates. It follows the blood flow, and then we have the tissues right here. The oxygen binds to the hemoglobin, so the hemoglobin actually transports the oxygen down to the tissues. Then at the tissue level, the oxygen will diffuse into the tissues. And then metabolism takes place. So, this is the oxygen in the tissue, the oxygen that you inspired. In there we have glucose. Glucose is a source of energy, which you get from the food that you eat. So the oxygen combines with the glucose, that's metabolism going on. And then that metabolism will produce ATP. Adenosine triphosphate is a form of energy. And that's what you're going to need for muscular activity. So the oxygen is part of what gives us energy to move around, because we produce energy by undergoing metabolism. That's one of the products of cellular metabolism. The next one is heat. when you undergo metabolism, you produce heat. And then the heat is used to maintain body temperature. If you're not undergoing metabolism, you're going to be cold. You don't have any heat in your body. So we are constantly undergoing metabolism, as long as we're breathing in. And there's one more product, which is CO2. Now, CO2 is a byproduct of metabolism. We don't really need it. It has to be exhaled out from the lungs. And we do that, but unfortunately, we cannot exhale all of it out. You have some of it dissolved in the plasma. And that's how we come up with that CO2, partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. Some of that CO2 that we're not exhaling out will dissolve. So what we're saying then is that as long as you don't have 35 to 45, excuse me, as long as you, if you have more than 45, then that would mean that you have accumulation of CO2. If you don't have up to 45, then that means you're blowing off very fast. So we have to have that much. Okay? So now my point here is that before you can get that oxygen from the air down all the way to the tissues, 4 things must take place. 4 things. The first one is ventilation. You have to breathe it in first. Because I mean, if you're apneic, there's no way you're going to even get the oxygen from the air. So that's how come we say that ventilation is the first life function. It has the utmost priority in the care of all patients. Now I tell you what, from today moving forward, if you are called to come and take care of a patient, when you get there, you ask yourself, are they ventilating, yes or no? I mean, it's just that simple. Are they breathing in and out, yes or no? Because if they're not, that is where your care is going to begin. If you're not breathing in and out, there's no need. Working on your blood pressure, there's no need putting oxygen on you. So I want you to know that. Another thing I want to tell you is that if you are given a blood gas, you ask yourself, is the CO2 greater than 45? Yes or no? Because that reflects ventilation. That's where you start. Ventilation has the highest priority. So we'll breathe the oxygen in. You gotta be able to breathe it in and out. And then the next thing is oxygenation. Remember, once you get the air in, it has to continue moving. It has to get into the blood. That is oxygenation. Oxygen going from the lungs to into the blood. That's oxygenation or diffusion. That's what we call that. And then we have circulation, where the blood has to be pumped out and circulate. And then we have perfusion, where the oxygen has to diffuse into the tissues. So 4 things. These are the 4 life functions. Anytime a life function is being created, you need to react immediately. Like if you give me a CO2 of 50, I'm like, oh my God, I'm not breathing well. Okay, I got to fix that first. Well, my CO2 is good, but the oxygen, PaO2 is 60. I go, oh my God, they don't have enough oxygen. So anytime any of the life functions is being threatened or is abnormal, you got to react to it. So let's take them one at a time. Any questions about what is meant by life function? Getting oxygen molecule from the air all the way down into the tissues. So ventilation is the movement of gas into and out of the lungs. That's all. Breathing in and out, if you want to make it simple, you breathe in, you breathe out. When you breathe in oxygen and other gases in the air. We have other gases in the air, really. We have nitrogen. In fact, we have more nitrogen in the air than we have oxygen. We have carbon dioxide in the air, but not as much as we have it in our lungs. But we are more interested in oxygen that we're breathing in. So we breathe in the air, which has oxygen in it, and then when we exhale out, we exhale out carbon dioxide. So ventilation is breathing in, breathe out. It is the first life function. Like I said, anytime you're given a blood gas, look at CO2 first. Don't worry about the pH, because low backup will make you have abnormal pH too. Okay, you look at your CO2 first. Okay? Most patients that don't ventilate well don't oxygenate well. Well, that is true. The way you oxygenate is by getting the oxygen into your lungs first. Well, if you can't get the oxygen good enough into your lungs, well, how is it going to cross over into the blood? You don't have nothing to cross over. So you have to ventilate well before you can oxygenate. But now, is it true that some people can oxygenate well without ventilating well? Well, that is true somehow. Somehow that's possible. You may have somebody that has high CO2 and also has high PaO2. Okay, but it is true that most patients that don't ventilate well will not oxygenate well. So that's how come when CO2 is abnormally high and oxygen is abnormally low, we have to fix the CO2 first. We got to get the patient breathing, because if we can get them breathing well enough, their oxygen may go up. Okay? So I'll give you an example here. So if I have a patient 7.30, 80, 30 is the PaO2. Well, that's severe hypoxemia. So if I was given this, I would be looking at that CO2 first. I wouldn't worry about oxygenation. Because I'm going to say, well, my patient is not breathing in and out well enough. Well, if I get them breathing in and out well enough, well, they're getting oxygen, then the oxygen will go up. But now, if I get this guy in the right range, but the patient is not oxygenating well, still not oxygenating well, then it's time for me to give them oxygen. You cannot give more oxygen when ventilation is bad, period. You got to fix ventilation first. Not everyone that needs oxygen needs ventilation. That is true. You go to the hospital, you're going to see a lot of people on oxygen, but they're not on the ventilator. The most common problem is oxygen. Ventilation is the first priority, but the most common problem that people have is oxygenation. That's how come you see more people wearing nasal cannula and stuff when you go to the hospital than being on the ventilator. If you go to the emergency room, not feeling well, I bet you're going to be on oxygen even before the doctor comes in to see you. Even if you're a family member that is visiting somebody in the ER and nothing is wrong with you, they will probably give you oxygen. So everybody gets oxygen. Well, I'm here visiting my uncle. Well, he has oxygen. They give you oxygen anyway. Because that's the most common problem. The adequacy of ventilation is primarily measured by the level of CO2. If you want to know whether somebody is ventilating accurately, you look at the level of CO2. The CO2 in the blood gas is what represents ventilation. And what we're saying here is that if the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in your blood is between 35 to 45, then you are ventilating adequately. If it's greater than 45, you are not ventilating adequately. It doesn't mean that the patient is apneic, but it means that the patient is not breathing in and out adequately. And that's what we pay attention to the most. High CO2. Well, if my CO2 is less than 35, is my patient ventilating? Yes. My patient is ventilating. In fact, they're ventilating all over the place. It's not a serious problem. It's not very serious compared to somebody who has high CO2. Less than 35 means that you are over-ventilating. So if I say, well, is a CO2 of 30 normal? The answer should be no, it is not normal, because normal is 35 and above. But now if I say, well, patient has a CO2 of 30, are they ventilating? Well, the answer is yes, they are ventilating. In fact, they are over-ventilating. Now, let me give you another example. Let's say that you walked in here and you saw two patients. One is over there, one is over there. That one over there is breathing 60 times a minute, and that one over there is only breathing 2 times a minute. Which one would you attend to first? Yeah. So when I have somebody ventilating 60 times, well, at least they're breathing in and out. What's the problem? But what I need to be doing is, why are they breathing very fast? That is something that we're going to talk about. Why is the patient breathing very fast? Okay, but this guy over here, I need to attend to first. What are other ways to measure ventilation? Well, I must tell you that the best way to measure the adequacy of ventilation is by getting a blood gas and looking at the CO2. That's the best way. If you really want to know that somebody is ventilating adequately, you gotta be getting a blood gas. But now there are other ways that we can assess the adequacy of ventilation without getting a blood gas. We can measure tidal volume. If a patient has adequate tidal volume, then it may mean that they're ventilating adequately. Not 100%. That's why I say that CO2 is the best way. But tidal volume gives you, an idea of how well the patient is ventilating. Respiratory rate. Well, normal spontaneous rate is 12 to 20 breaths per minute. When I got a patient breathing 4 times a minute, there's no way that they will be blowing off enough CO2. Their CO2 may be rising. But now if a patient is breathing between 12 to 20, well, I can assume that they're blowing off enough CO2 to maintain it between 35 to 45. Just rise and fall. We'll give you an idea of how well somebody is ventilating. Because anytime you breathe in, your chest rises. If you breathe out, it drops. Well, If your chest is not rising and falling, well, you're not ventilating. There are some therapies that we do that we use just rise and fall to assess the adequacy of ventilation, like the IPPB unit. Okay. You look at the patient's chest rising and falling. You have just intubated your patient. One of the ways that you're going to quickly assess whether the patient is ventilating is by looking at chest rise and fall. Capnograph. Capnograph is an equipment that measures exhaled CO2. It measures exhaled CO2. Sometimes we have it, hooked up to somebody who is on the ventilator. Okay? It is a non-invasive monitor which can correlate with arterial CO2. Anytime we put somebody on a capnograph, initially we draw a blood gas, and then we draw a blood gas, and then we run it, and then we see whether the CO2 from the blood gas is correlating with the CO2 that the capnography is displaying. If that is the case, then we can use the capnography for trending. In other words, I can look at my capnography and it's 40. I'm like, oh, okay, the CO2 is 40. I look at it the next minute, it's reading 80. I say, oh my God, the CO2 is very high. Okay? So these are other ways that we can assess the adequacy of ventilation. But for your information, the capnography CO2 is usually 5 to 10 points higher than the arterial CO2. 5 to 10 points higher than the arterial CO2. So if I look at my capnography and it's reading 45, I can say, well, my arterial CO2 is about 40. Okay? Like that. And then we'll go to the next line function, which is oxygenation. It's the second most important life function. If somebody is ventilating well, meaning that their CO2 is in the normal range, then my next question is, are they oxygenating? Let's say that I'm down in the department, respiratory department, and then I get a call, Abba, please come to the 5th floor. We got a patient that is not breathing well. Please hurry. And then I drop my lunch that I'm eating, and then I run up there. And once I get there, are they breathing? Huh? Are they breathing in and out? Oh yeah, they're breathing in and out. Well, get me a pulse oximeter. What's their oxygen? Okay, so you got to do it that way. If they're breathing well, go to oxygenation. What's the patient's oxygenation level? So, primarily, we measure oxygenation by looking at the PaO2, the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. But it is not the best way. If you really want to assess somebody's oxygenation status, you look at the CaO2. Okay, I'm going to write down a formula that I think you may have seen before. Have you seen this formula before? There are two ways that oxygen is carried in the blood. Two ways. It is carried dissolved in the plasma, and then it is carried on the hemoglobin. So like right here, from here to here, is the amount of oxygen attached to the hemoglobin. In fact, more oxygen, way more than double oxygen that we get, is attached to the hemoglobin. And then we have some of it dissolved in the plasma. So, PaO2 is the amount of oxygen dissolved in the plasma. For every 1 millimeter of mercury of PaO2, every 1 millimeter of mercury of PaO2, partial pressure, you have 0.003 milliliter of oxygen dissolved in the plasma. Very small. But the fact, though, is that you have to have oxygen dissolved in the plasma before the hemoglobin can pick it up. And that is true. So if you don't have enough oxygen in your plasma, then you're not going to have enough oxygen binding to the hemoglobin anyway. But now, if you don't have enough hemoglobin, let's say if you have anemia, and you have all the oxygen in the world dissolved in the plasma, well, there's nothing to pick it up. So either way, you are dead. But this is the most important here. So that's what we're saying here. CaO2, you gotta remember that we're gonna work this formula down the line, okay? The normal CaO2 is 20 volume percent, a combination of the amount of oxygen dissolved in the plasma plus the amount of oxygen attached to the hemoglobin. That's the best way. If you're just looking at the PaO2, it gives you an idea, but it's not the entire picture of it. That's what we use the entire time. Okay? So if you have normal PaO2, we can assume that somebody is oxygenating well, but it's not always true. Because if you don't have enough hemoglobin, then oxygen will not be transported to the tissues where the oxygen is needed. You're going to have what we call hypoxia. Hypoxia is different from hypoxemia, right? Hypoxemia is shortage of oxygen in the blood when you don't have enough PaO2. Hypoxia is shortage of oxygen in the tissues. That's very important. That's the most important. They're down in the tissues because that's where we need it to produce the energy and heat and everything that we need. I want you to remember that, okay? It is the best index of tissue oxygenation. What are other ways to measure the adequacy of oxygenation? Other than these two here, there's other ways that we can measure that. All right. Now, let me tell you this, please. Anytime you run into a patient that has tachycardia, please, if you don't know what else to give oxygen. If you don't know what else to give, you give oxygen because anytime you don't have oxygen, enough oxygen, your heart rate goes up. The very first sign of hypoxemia is tachycardia. If you doubt it, you can hold your breath for a while and check your heart rate. So high heart rate equals oxygenation. The heart needs a lot of oxygen. It would go crazy if it doesn't have oxygen. Sensorium. Whether a patient is oriented or not. Confusion. Low oxygen level can cause confusion, get you confused. You don't know where you are right now. You don't know who is standing beside you. When people have severe hypoxemia, they get that way because then that means also that you're not getting adequate oxygen in your brain. you'll be confused. So anytime we run into somebody who is confused, my name is Albert, but they're calling me Brian, something may be wrong. So that's why we do that assessment. If you remember, when you do your patient assessment, you ask them that question to three places: to time, a person, and place. Where are you right now? Okay. And the patient goes, well, I'm over here at my Burger King getting some hamburger. He said, no, you're here in the hospital. You have some problem with your breathing, and then we brought you in here. You correct them. Who is the president of the United States? Instead of Joe Biden, they may say, well, Putin. He said, no, Putin is the guy over there in Ukraine fighting right now. Biden is the president. So you correct the patient. So you're assessing the level of oxygen in their brain. That's what we're doing. You're assessing for cerebral hypoxemia. All right? So now let's see if there is something else. So we got the heart rate. We got the sensorium. So that's it. Okay? All right. Oxygen gets into the blood through the process of diffusion. Oh, I missed one. Let's just put SaO2 and SpO2. We can use pulse oximeter. It's not the best though, because if you have carbon monoxide, it's not going to read well, but we use it to measure the adequacy of oxygenation. This one here is SaO2. When you draw blood gas, then you run it through your blood gas analyzer, and then it gives you the oxygen saturation. The last one is when you use the pulse oximeter. Okay? All right. So, oxygen gets into the blood through the process of diffusion. Diffusion is the movement of gas from area of high concentration to area of low concentration. Movement of gas from area of high concentration to area of low concentration. What's normal atmospheric pressure? Anybody?
760.
760, very good. 760 now. Now that pressure is generated by all the gases in the atmosphere. Nitrogen contributes to that pressure. Oxygen contributes to that pressure. Carbon dioxide contributes to that pressure. If you remember that Dalton's law of partial pressure. Dalton's law of partial pressure. Okay, so what it says is that the amount of pressure exerted by a mixture of gases, like we have nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide in the air. The amount of pressure exerted by a mixture of gases is the sum of the individual pressures exerted by the individual gas in the mixture. So now, we know that on Rumel we have 21% oxygen. So if I want to know the partial pressure of oxygen in the air, how much pressure the oxygen is exerting, I'm going to multiply that 760 by 2.1, by 0.21, sorry. When you do that, you get like approximately 160. So that's the amount of pressure exerted by oxygen. So that's inside the lungs once you breathe in. But now, down here in the blood, somebody is hypoxemic. Let's say that their PaO2 is only 60. Partial pressure of oxygen in their blood is 60. We got 160 here, So diffusion is the movement of gas from area of high concentration to area of low concentration. We have less here than we have here. So oxygen is going to go in here, always. The diffusion for oxygen from the lungs into the blood is sometimes very difficult because we may have other issues, like if you have fluid in your lungs. But that is not true with CO2. The diffusion gradient for CO2 is always out of the body. CO2 wants to get out. Even in dead people, CO2 wants to get out. Because you know why? We have like a 0.03% CO2 in the air. Very small. If you multiply that number by 760, CO2 only exhausts about 22 millimeters of mercury. That's what we have in here. And then in your blood, you have 35 to 45 if you have none. But then if you're not breathing well, it's going to be higher than that. So the diffusion gradient for CO2 is that way. It wants to get out. If you die, it still wants to get out even quicker, because then you're not breathing in. So that's the way we oxygenate, by oxygen moving from the lungs into the blood through the process of diffusion. Another name for diffusion is respiration. It's the same thing. Respiration is diffusion. Because respiration is the movement of gas across a membrane. The movement of gas across a membrane. Well, we do have a membrane here. We have a capillary membrane right here, where the oxygen must cross over before it gets into the blood. Okay, so when they say diffusion of oxygen, you say respiration. Respiration and ventilation are not the same. Ventilation is just breathing in and breathing out. Respiration is the gas is crossing over the alveolar capillary membrane into the blood. That's respiration. Somebody can ventilate well, but don't respire well. Okay? All right, so we have two types of respiration. We have what we call the external respiration. And that is, let me rephrase it this way. In external respiration, oxygen inside the lungs diffuses into the blood, and carbon dioxide in the blood diffuses into the lungs to be exhaled out. Let me say that one more time. In external respiration, oxygen inside the lungs will diffuse into the blood, and carbon dioxide in the blood will diffuse into the lungs to be exhaled out. Yeah, the carbon dioxide that we produce from metabolism, once they diffuse out of the tissues, they quickly mix up with bicarbonate. They quickly mix up with CO2 and turn into bicarbonate. And then when they get around to the lungs, they break again to CO2 and water. And then the CO2 leaves the lungs. Okay? All right, so internal respiration is where the oxygen is diffusing from the blood into the tissues, and the carbon dioxide is diffusing from the tissues into the blood. Any questions? If you want to the internal, you can call that cellular, cellular respiration. That's an name for cellular respiration.
Can you repeat that one more time?
Okay, so internal respiration is oxygen in the blood will diffuse into the tissues, and carbon dioxide in the tissues will diffuse into the blood. In external respiration, oxygen in the lungs will diffuse into the blood, and carbon dioxide in the blood will diffuse into the lungs. Any questions about that? Both of them are very important. So now let's review some ventilator parameters from last semester. Tidal volume. Tidal volume is the amount of volume inspired or expired in one breath. This is one of the most common things that a respiratory therapist has to know when they graduate, because if you don't understand what tidal volume is, you may have to go back to school and become a medical assistant person. Medical assistant, they don't know what tidal volume is. They're not doing respiratory therapy. It's very common. Now with tidal volume, 6 to 8 mils per kg. On the ventilator, we have mechanical tidal volume. The amount of tidal volume that is normal to put a patient on if you are going to commit them to a ventilator. We use 6 to 8 mils per kg. It depends on how much the patient is weighing. For instance, if I have a patient that weighs, let's say 40 kg, okay? And I want to determine the normal tidal volume, the normal range of the tidal volume. I'm going to multiply 6 by 40, that will give me 240, is that correct? 242 multiply 40 by 8, that will give me 48 to 480. So, the normal range of tidal volume for somebody who is weighing 40 kg is 240 to 480. Any number you pick between those two will be correct, normal tidal volume. But the fact is that when we get ready to put a patient on the ventilator, we always pick the lowest end of the tidal volume, so as to avoid too much pressure, because too much pressure is not good. So you need to memorize that number, 6 to 8 mils per kg. Okay? But that's different from spontaneous tidal volume. That's your normal tidal volume when you are not intubated, when you're just breathing on your own. It is 5 to 8 mils per kg. So you take how much you weigh in kg, you multiply by 5, and then you multiply by 8. That will be your normal range. Any questions about that? Now, let's say that you say, well, somebody is exhaling 300, somebody's exhaling 300 milliliter of volume anytime they exhale out. The patient is 50 kg, and you're asking me, well, is that normal tidal volume for them? Well, what I have to do is, I have to divide the 300 by 50, and that will give me 6. Well, it falls between these two numbers. So that would be normal spontaneous tidal volume. Tidal volume is based on how tall you are, because your ideal body weight is based on how tall you are. Okay? How big you are doesn't really affect the amount of tidal volume that you have. It's how tall you are. Any questions about that? So on the test, they may give you the exact tidal volume, and then they ask you, well, is that normal for this patient who weighs this much? Then you're going to have to divide it out. Tidal volume equals flow times inspiratory time. I want you to see flow as the air coming out from the ventilator, the air, the speed of the air coming out from the ventilator. That's what the flow is. It comes out and then it builds up somewhere inside your lungs, somewhere inside your lungs, over a period of time. Let's say the air is coming out and it comes out, for 1 second. Well, what did it accumulate to? What it accumulated to is your volume. How long it took for it to come out is your I time. So flow is nothing but the air, the speed of the air coming out from the ventilator. So if I want to calculate my tidal volume, I will take the speed of the air coming out from the ventilator and how long it came out. If I want to calculate my tidal volume, I go, okay, what's the speed of the air going inside my lungs? How long did I have to breathe it in or have it coming into my lungs? That's what it is. So tidal volume is flow times I time. I time is the amount of time it takes you to breathe in. Tidal volume affects ventilation. How do we measure ventilation? Can somebody tell me how we measure, the best way to measure ventilation?
CO2.
CO2, right? So when we say that tidal volume affects ventilation, in other words, what we're saying is that tidal volume impacts the level of CO2. That's what we're saying. The higher the tidal volume, the lower your CO2, because you're blowing it off. The lower your tidal volume, the higher your CO2. When somebody has high CO2, one of the things that we can do is to tell them to take some deep breaths. And they'll blow some of it off. So on the ventilator, once you go there and increase your tidal volume significantly, you're going to find out that the patient's CO2 will decrease. It is measured in milliliter or liter. Almost, any human being should have a tidal volume that is less than 1 liter. Unless you are just like an elephant or something like that. That would be the only way. I mean, I've never really seen anybody that has a spontaneous tidal volume that is more than 1 liter. Usually it's less than that, but it is possible now because I'm still to meet the tallest person in the world. I haven't met them yet, so I have no idea how much a tidal volume is. All right, so respiratory rate. All of us knew about that even before we came into respiratory. You have to know what's your respiratory rate. You don't have to go to school to know that. Is how many times you are breathing in 1 minute. Normal is 12 to 20. That's spontaneous respiratory rate. And how about on the ventilator, when you want to put your patient on the ventilator, that's different. We'll call that ventilator rate. We start off from 10 to 20. If you're going to put your patient on the ventilator, you start them with a respiratory rate of 10 to 20, at least. Respiratory rate impacts ventilation. It affects your CO2. The higher your respiratory rate, the lower your CO2. The more you're going to blow it off. The lower your respiratory rate, the higher your CO2. So, initially, if I put my patient, started ventilating them with a respiratory rate of 16, for instance, I pick a number between 10 to 20. If I say, well, why don't you start them on 16? How would I know whether 16 is enough or too much? How would I know that?
Looking at their CO2?
Huh?
Sorry, looking at their CO2.
Very good. You gotta do a blood gas. Because now, if my CO2 now is very low, less than 35, where that respiratory rate is too high, I will turn it down. If my CO2 is very high, well, the respiratory rate is not enough, I gotta turn it up. So it is a protocol for a respiratory therapist to get a blood gas 45 minutes to 1 hour after you put your patient on the ventilator. Because you want to make sure that the FiO2 that you picked is giving them adequate oxygenation, the respiratory rate or the tidal volume is giving them adequate ventilation. So it is a protocol. Anytime you make a major change on the ventilator, you got to do a blood gas. Minute volume. Now, minute volume is the amount of volume inspired or expired in 1 minute. You are breathing in and out for 1 minute. At the end of the 1 minute, we're going to stop you, and then we'll take a reading of how much volume that you inspired or expired in 1 minute. That's called the minute volume. So minute volume is tidal volume, the amount of volume that you're breathing in each time that you breathe in, the average volume, times your respiratory rate. So, let me write down the formula here. Look at this here. Minute volume equals tidal volume times respiratory rate. Yeah. Well, assuming that I'm given the respiratory rate and the minute volume, and they want me to calculate the tidal volume, it will be the same formula. So I can go, well, tidal volume equals minute volume divided by respiratory rate. We are just changing the subject of the formula. The subject of the formula here is minute volume. I just change it to tidal volume. That's what we're looking for. Or maybe they can say, well, a patient has a minute volume of so, and they have a tidal volume of so. What is their respiratory rate? Well, I want to make respiratory rate the subject here. So I go, respiratory rate equals minute volume divided by tidal volume. I want you to be able to do the formula that way. So now let me give you an example. Let's say that my patient, this one here, right? Okay. Let me say that my patient has a tidal volume of 600 milliliter. And they're breathing 10 times a minute. And I want to calculate their minute volume. What I have to do is multiply 600 by 10. That will give me 6,000 milliliter. Now the standard unit for minute volume is in liters. So I have 6,000 milliliter. I have to divide it by 1,000. And then that will give me 6 liters per minute. That's my minute volume. And now let's say that my patient has a minute volume of 6 liters per minute, and the patient is breathing 10 times a minute. And I want to find out what the tidal volume is. How much volume are they breathing in each time? So I can go minute volume now is 6 liters. I have to convert that to milliliter, because my tidal volume will be in milliliter. So I go, well, multiply by 1,000, that gives me 6,000. divided by 10, come back to that 600 milliliter. And then respiratory rate, then I have minute volume 6,000 divided by a tidal volume of 600. Let me do this. So I'm back to 10 here. So the formula works. It checks out. All right, so it's your turn now. I want everybody to work this out. A patient has a minute volume of 8 liters per minute, and their respiratory rate is 20 per minute. What's the patient's tidal volume? What you got?
400 ml.
Okay. What unit would that be in?
Milliliters.
Are you sure? Check again. 0.4. Is it milliliter or is it liter?
24 liters. Sorry.
Okay. What do you got? Everybody got 400 milliliter or 0.4 liter. Okay? All right. So now if you can do this, you can do it any other way like that. Okay? Okay, so minute volume affects the adequacy of ventilation. The higher your minute volume, the lower your CO2. The lower your minute volume, the higher your CO2. Now, we talked about tidal volume and respiratory rate here. And what we said is that the higher the tidal volume, the lower the CO2, vice versa. The higher the respiratory rate, the lower the CO2 and vice versa. So it's the same thing. Increasing minute volume is like increasing your tidal volume or your respiratory rate. Anytime your minute volume increases, it's either that you're breathing faster or you're breathing deeper. So, let's say on the exam, you are given a blood gas that is acidic. Mr. Smith is on the ventilator and the respiratory therapist just obtained blood gases. Here is the result. And they go, which of the following will the respiratory therapist do next? Well, we know that we're going to blow some CO2, right? And one of the ways that you can do it is by your tidal volume, and then that will be increase your tidal volume, but you don't see that. What they're giving to you is decrease the tidal volume. Would that work? No, that doesn't work. That will make it worse. Well, that leaves you with respiratory rate, and normally you'll be looking for increase the respiratory rate because you gotta blow it off. But now they're giving you decrease your respiratory rate. You say, no, I'm not gonna do that either. But there is that answer that says increase the minute volume. Wouldn't that be the same thing? If you're increasing your minute volume, you are either increasing your tidal volume or your respiratory rate. So that would be a good answer. Okay? That will be a good answer. Any questions about minute volume? Okay, so now we're going into flow. Flow is tidal volume divided by I time. I want to find out the speed of flow. So what I'm going to do is, all of that air that came out from the ventilator and accumulated inside the lungs, and I know how long it took for it to accumulate inside the lungs. What is the speed of the flow? So what I'm going to do then is I will take that tidal volume that accumulated inside the lungs, divide it by the amount of time it came out from the ventilator. That's your flow. Right? Liters per minute. How many liters of the air came out in 1 minute? That's what it means. Flow rate affects inspiratory and expiratory time. I usually do, I usually have like 2 cups to demonstrate that. Flow rate. On the volume control mode, one of the ways to shorten your I time is to increase your flow. God, why did I forget that cup? Okay, so now I have this cup here that's empty. Okay, I have another cup that has water in it, and I want to fill this cup up. So I'm start pouring here. So if I pour very fast, like that, this one here fills up very quickly, right? So I have a shorter time because I have higher flow. I go very fast pouring, the flow is high, and then it fills up quicker. So the higher the flow, the shorter the high time. Well, if I decide to pour it in there slowly, it will take a longer time to fill up. So my I time is lengthened. So the lower the flow, the longer the I time. So anytime you want to adjust your I time or your E time on your volume control mode, use your flow knob. If you turn up your flow, your I time shortens, your E time increases, and vice versa. Okay? I time, I've already talked about amount of time it takes you to breathe in. E time is the amount of time it takes you to breathe out. We're going to do respiratory pattern here. Now let's do calculation here. I want you to memorize that formula, which says that tidal volume, I times equals tidal volume divided by I time. No, wait a minute. I time divided by flow, sorry. If you change that formula around, you will get the same thing. Memorize it this way, that formula, memorize it this way. Because it's the same thing. The way I got this here, if I wanted to get this here from this, I'm just going to cross multiply that way. And then I have the flow times I time equals tidal volume. And then if I divide both sides by 1/t, so that cancels out, and then I have I time here. Something I have over there, okay? But I like to memorize it this way. That's the best way to do it. Memorize it. I time equals tidal volume. Now, in liter divided by flow in liters per minute. Now, the standard unit for flow is liters per minute. So now let's say that my patient has the tidal volume of 600, tidal volume of 600, and the speed of flow coming inside their lungs, the flow rate is 60 liters per minute. Let me change this one here. Liters per second is something used to be here. And then I went to calculate my high time. I used that formula there. So the formula calls for me to convert the tidal volume to liter. Right now I have it in milliliter. So I'm gonna divide by 1,000. So that gives me 0.6 hectare. And then the formula calls for me to convert the flow to liters per second. It is given in liters per minute. So I will divide by 60. And then that gives me 1, right? So 1 is here. So my I time becomes 0.6 second. 0.6 second. Now my flow is 60 liters per minute. I want to see if we can get, since we know what the I time is now, over here, and we know what the tidal volume is, can we get the same flow? Because the flow rate is 60 liters per minute. So let me use this formula here. I want to tell you that it's all about changing the formula around. So now I'm giving a tidal volume of 600, and then I'm giving I time of 0.6 seconds, and they're asking me to calculate my flow. So I'll go, well, tidal volume in liter, I'll convert that to liter, that will be 0.6 on top. And my I time is 6 seconds. 6 seconds. So 0.6. Now this, remember this is in liter now. 0.6 liter. That's what this is. This is in second here. So what I have now, divide this out, is I have 1 liter per second. That's what I have. But now I need to convert that to liters per minute. I will multiply by 60. Right? So we're back to 60. It's the same formula. Okay? We're going to do more of this down the line. FiO2. That's one of the parameters that you have to set at the moment if you're going to ventilate your patient. Fractional inspired oxygen. Fractional inspired oxygen. Anything else other than 100%? How do we get that on the ventilator? Well, we have air coming in, we have oxygen coming in. Anytime you turn the knob to change your FiO2, what you are actually doing is there's a valve there where the hose hooks up at the back of the ventilator. Once you turn that knob or point something to change it, you are decreasing the middle valve. So it's like this. So you turn it to 40, 60%. You close the inlet of air some so that you don't have enough air coming in to mix up with the 100% oxygen coming in. If I want my FiO2 to be 28%, once I turn it, I open up the valve so that a whole lot of air is coming in to mix up with the 100% oxygen. That's the way it works. So that's why we say fractional inspired oxygen. If it's 100%, well, it's 100% oxygen. If it's 21%, it's 21%. So it's actually anything else other than 100%. Okay? So FiO2. Now, FiO2 improves oxygenation under normal conditions. Under normal conditions, FiO2 improves oxygenation. The higher the FiO2, the higher the PaO2. The lower the FiO2, the lower the PaO2. The only exception is when you have shunts. It's only when you have shunts. That's when the FiO2 will not necessarily increase your PaO2 when you are increasing it. Now, what is shunts? This is shunts. This is normal alveolus here. This is a collapsed alveolus. When you have atelectasis, we'll call that intrapulmonary shunts. Intrapulmonary shunts. Collapsed lungs. Atelectasis causes intrapulmonary shunt. Now, actually, I have these two lung units here, and I want to get oxygen inside the blood. Remember, oxygen goes in through diffusion. Now, so here, I have what we call the surface area. Surface area is just the area through which oxygen can diffuse. I have all the surface area through which oxygen can cross over from the lungs into the blood. Definitely, I'm going to get more oxygen if I am increasing my FiO2. Because I have enough space for it to go through. But now look at this one here. This is all I got. I have reduced surface area. One of the things, or another factor that affects the rate of diffusion is surface area. The first one was concentration gradient. So what do we do here? This is when we need PEEP. You gotta open it up. So my point is that if your lung units are this way, no matter how much oxygen that you put in there, it's not gonna go anywhere. I'm sorry. If you want the oxygen to go in there, you gotta open it up. You're gonna have to add PEEP and blow it up just like this. So you have more surface area for gas diffusion. So that's why I'm saying that under normal conditions, as long as you don't have shunts, increasing FiO2 will increase PaO2. But if you have shunts, it's not going to do it. The only way we're going to get it to increase is when we add PEEP. Self-level of FiO2. Now, FiO2, oxygen is a drug. Oxygen is a drug. So we're going to be very careful in giving somebody oxygen, too much oxygen. So self-level of oxygen is any oxygen level that is between 50 to 60. No, I take that back, sorry. Less than 50. FiO2 is safe level. So as a respiratory therapist, your goal is to bring your patient's FiO2 to below 50 as long as their O2 saturation is staying up. That's what a good respiratory therapist should do. And then if you go to the hospital, you see some patients that have been on 100% oxygen for 2 weeks, but they're something like 98%. And then you have therapists come around, well, patient doing well, O2 saturation, 98% on 50% or 55%. Well, why can't you win it down? If you go in there and check their O2 saturation, and it's above 95, you turn it down. You're saving the patient from being harmed because oxygen can cause some problems. So that's your goal. Keep that in mind. That's your goal as a respiratory therapist. If you win that patient down to below 50, you save them a lot of problems. They don't need to be on it if they don't need it. Unsafe level of FiO2, well, 50 to 60 is unsafe. 50 to 60 is unsafe. And then dangerous or toxic level of FiO2, greater than 60%. Greater than 60%. That's how come when somebody is on oxygen therapy, once we get to 60%, we stop there. We check their PaO2. If their PaO2 is not where you want it to be, the next move is to add PEEP. You don't have to keep on giving them oxygen if you can use PEEP. I mean, it doesn't mean that you can never use FiO2 greater than 6. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you are better off. You're saving the patient a lot of problems by using pressure, if you can use it, than continuing to use high FiO2s. All right? Let's do complications of high FiO2. So, when you have somebody on any FiO2 that is greater than 60% for up to 24 hours or more, you see a lot of complications. The patient can have a lot of complications. All right, so you can have, number one, you can have oxygen-induced hypoventilation. That's in COPD patients. I mean, this complicated English here just means that you can give a COPD patient too much oxygen, because that can knock out their hypoxic drive. Too much oxygen will slow them down, slow down their respiratory rate, and then allow their CO2 to rise, which is hypoventilation. We don't want to do that. You can cause what they call absorption absorption atelectasis. The last atelectasis is lung collapse. So what happens is that anytime we breathe in air, we are breathing in more nitrogen, because you have 78.9% nitrogen in room air. We only got 21% oxygen. So we breathe in more nitrogen than we actually breathe in more oxygen. But the difference is that the nitrogen does not cross the alveolar capillary membrane to go into the blood, because the amount of nitrogen inside the body is equivalent to what you just inspired. So there's no diffusion gradient. It's not going to go anywhere. Like I said before, for you to get something to diffuse, well, on this end, it must be greater than on this end before it can move. So I have the same amount I have inside the body compared to what is inside the lung, so it doesn't go anywhere. So that nitrogen doesn't go in the blood, but it stays inside the lungs. It's the volume of nitrogen. That's what keeps the lungs open. That's what maintains the functional residual capacity, the nitrogen. If you went to your PFT, you can remember when they said that test they call nitrogen washout. They make you breathe in 100% oxygen. You wash out the nitrogen, then your lungs will collapse. So if you give somebody too much oxygen, greater than 60%, you can wash out some of the nitrogen inside their lungs. The volume of nitrogen will deplete. Therefore, their lungs will collapse. So that's called absorption atelectasis. For that reason, this is very important, for that reason, never you increase the FiO2 of any patient by more than 10 points at a time. No, that's exam. I don't care if they do that at UNM, but never you increase the FiO2 by more than 10 points at a time. For instance, my patient is currently on 35%. They have bad oxygenation. The respiratory therapist will increase the FiO2 to 40, that's A. Increase the FiO2 to 80%. No, I'm gonna pick 40% first. Because if I went up to 80%, I'm going up by more than 10 points at a time. That may deplete the nitrogen volume and cause atelectasis. And by the way, let me just say this before I forget. On any therapy that you're giving, you must always do gradually. You go up gradually. It's not just FiO2, PEEP, tidal volume, medication. If somebody is anxious, for instance, you may give them like 0.5 milligram of Ativan just to see how they feel before you increase it to like 2. But you can't start with 2. If you're thirsty, first of all, you drink 1 cup of water, but you can't drink a drum of water the first time, right? So anything you do it gradually, going up. And then, if it is too much, you turn it down gradually. Okay? This is on anything, it's not just mechanical ventilation, on anything that you do. Okay? You've done a PEEP of 5, they need more PEEP, and they give you a choice of 8 and 10, when you pick 8 first, because you want to do it gradually. All right, so absorption atelectasis, and then we can have usually, yes, number 3 is retinopathy of prematurity. Retinopathy of prematurity. This is a condition that is caused by a baby receiving too much oxygen. Babies don't need too much oxygen. That can damage their eyes. Too much oxygen damages the baby's eyes. The normal PaO2 for a baby is 50 to 70 millimeters of mercury. That you're really pushing it 80, no more than 80, please. No more than 80, because studies have shown that anytime a baby receives a PaO2 that is greater than 80, they will get that. Retinopathy of prematurity. That will make them blind. And then number 4, and then we're going to break, we have oxygen toxicity. That usually happens 48 hours, 24 hours after a patient is put on a FiO2 that is greater than 60%. Now, oxygen toxicity means that your tissues can become more fiber optic. You have more fibers now developing inside your lungs. The more fibers that you have, the lower your lung compliance will be. You can have some of the tissues die. It can cause a decrease in surfactant production. It can cause atelectasis. Oxygen toxicity causes a lot of stuff. So that's why I said that as a good respiratory therapist, your goal is to win your patient to below 50% FiO2 as long as their O2 saturation is staying above 95. All right, so we're going to take a break now. How long do you want to be gone? 15 minutes? Is that good? So we'll come back